public nemesis media.
Јас, да речеме, сум бил секогаш одличен по историја. Ако си ти учил југословенската историја и да бидеш при тоа одличен, не можеш да не ги правиш бугарите.
Единиците на монархофашистичка Бугарија,
бугарските фашистички окупаторски власти,
бугарската фашистичка пета армија,
фашистичка Бугарија,
фашистичка Бугарија.
Јас толку сум ги мразел бугарите што татко ми кога го носише кашкавалот од Бугарија, јас не сум го јадал затоа што бил бугарски кашкавал.
Петата окупаторска бугарска армија,
бугарските окупаторски власти,
окупирана Македонија, окупацијата на Македонија.
Јас сум бил дел на истата политика која класична југословенска. Како мал со другари сме бушеле гуми на бугарски коли.
Асимилација и трајна доминација во Македонија во периодот на Втората светска војна.
Донесен е едностран акт за промена на националноста и асимилација на населението на окупираното подрачје.
Денационализаторска и асимилаторска улога.
Асимилаторска дејност.
Бугаризирање на македонскиот народ.
Како македонец не можеше никој да се декларира.
Зашто се прекина тоа, таа мрза?
Да го разединат македонскиот народ, да му провоцираат братоубиствена војна и да му наметнат своја власт. Окупаторските власти својата активност ја насочија во ширењето омраза спрема југословенските народи.
Кога почнав да ја читам македонската историја, кога ја осознав македонската историја, едноставно сватив дека ние сме еден манипулиран народ.
Slavs are one unusual group of people. I can't think of any other family whose members fight and hate one another so much. Being a Slav myself, it hurts me a lot to see my brothers and sisters not getting along, even today. How can it not hurt me when I see with my own eyes two fraternal nations whose blood flows through my veins fight each other viciously? The two nations I'm talking about are Macedonians and Bulgarians. Within the Slavic world, you cannot find two nations who are more similar than Macedonians and Bulgarians. How can two people groups who have nearly identical languages, a common history and culture be so distant? What happened? The answer to that question is far from simple. There were many ups and downs in the long history of Macedono-Bulgarian relations, but those relations were not turned into something ugly because of a mistake from either of the two people. On the contrary, most of the destruction of Macedono-Bulgarian relations came from the outside, which was so successful we're seeing and feeling its consequences even today. This video is going to explain who did it, how did they do it, and why. The story of Macedono-Bulgarian relations, the ethnogenesis of modern Macedonians, and the beginning of the Macedonian question start in the year of 1878. Following the Russo-Turkish War, the victorious Russians have forced the Ottomans to ask for peace, which came on 3rd of March 1878 with the signing of the Treaty of San Stefano. This treaty created an autonomous principality of Bulgaria, a de facto large Bulgarian state made out of territories from three regions that Bulgarians have lived on for over 1,000 years: Mysia, Thrace, and Macedonia. The Russians were happy to have a large vassal on the Balkans, the Bulgarians were happy to be united in one single territory, and others were everything but happy. Here's the thing, other Balkan nations were afraid of a powerful Bulgarian state that could dominate the Balkan Peninsula, and Western powers were afraid that such Bulgarian state would be a very effective proxy for Russian influence in the Balkans. Only 4 months and 10 days later, the Western powers and Russia have met in Berlin and signed the aptly titled Treaty of Berlin. The agreement resulted in disconnecting of Macedonia from the no longer unified Bulgaria, and what was left of Bulgaria was divided into the Principality of Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia. Needless to say, the Bulgarians in Macedonia were furious. In fact, they were so furious that they started a whole rebellion to re-establish the borders of San Stefano, Bulgaria. This rebellion is today known as the Kresna Razlog uprising and sometimes as the Macedonian uprising. That uprising lasted for a little over 6 months. However, it was a failure and the Bulgarians in Macedonia stayed separated from their brothers on the east. One Bulgarian teacher and revolutionary born in Macedonia named Trajko Kitanchev wrote a really angry song called From the Top of Pirin Mountain, where he cursed Europe for putting Macedonia back under slavery with the Berlin Treaty. The song captures pretty well how Bulgarians in Macedonia felt. This pretty much started the entire process of separating Macedonians from Bulgarians into their own thing. You may have noticed that I use terms like Macedono-Bulgarians, Bulgarians from Macedonia, and Macedonians interchangeably. I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time to explain why I do that so you can have a better understanding on who exactly are modern Macedonians. So there is a region in the Balkans called Macedonia, which existed for over 2,000 years, albeit its borders would change a couple of times throughout history. In the 19th century, the region of Macedonia looked like this, and it was arguably the most diverse area of the Balkan Peninsula. This region was home to many different people, including, but not limited to, Turks, Greeks, Albanians, Vlachs, and the most numerous of them all, Bulgarians. At first, these Macedonian Bulgarians were separated from Bulgarians in Bulgaria by territory. Later came more distancing due to a language dispute and conflict between Macedonian Bulgarians and the Bulgarian government. Because of that separation and the fact that so many nations were against Bulgarians uniting, as seen in 1885, when Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia joined into one Bulgarian state, the Macedonian Bulgarians decided to take a different route, an autonomous Macedonia. And so, in 1893, 6 Macedonian Bulgarians laid the foundation for the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or IMRO for short. As stated by its first president, Dr. Hristo Tatarchev in his memoirs, the goal of IMRO was an autonomous Macedonia that could later join Bulgaria or act as a unifying link in a future Balkan Federation. Some revolutionaries didn't even want to join Bulgaria, but instead advocated for a Macedonian state where everyone can live together regardless of their ethnicity, language, religion, etc. This idea was known as Macedonia for the Macedonians. As awesome as this idea sounded, there was one tiny problem. It was supported only by its Bulgarian inhabitants. The Bulgarians in Macedonia have offered other people groups cooperation in achieving Macedonia's autonomy. However, their offers were ignored. Even when the constitution of IMRO was changed in order to allow non-Bulgarians to join it, the only group of people that actually became IMRO members were Vlachs. It's not a coincidence that Vasil Kuntrov, a ethnographer from Bulgaria, wrote in one of his works that Bulgarians and Vlachs in Macedonia called themselves Macedonians, and even other people called them Macedonians, while everyone else did not call themselves Macedonians. It's an unusual situation where everybody who lived in the region of Macedonia was Macedonian, but that label was carried only by 2 of its people groups. Nevertheless, this regional identity was very powerful among Macedonian Bulgarians, so much so that it overpowered the Bulgarian ethnic identity among some of them. In his first book, revolutionary Pavel Shatev wrote that he met some Bulgarians in a Turkish prison that said they were Bulgarians by nationality, but first and foremost, they felt like Macedonians. The book came out in 1903, and even today, you can meet people that say how their ancestors who lived in Ottoman Macedonia felt like Macedonians first, and then like Bulgarians.
чувството македонско постоело секогаш. Регионот, географскиот регион Македонија постои од 1000 години. Луѓето кои живели на тој регион се нарекували македонци. Па еве јас бев во сабота во Куклен, моите предци, на прабаба ми братот, кој бил учесник дури во прва свет со грчка униформа, имам само че сликата е во тоа. И тие кажуваат, да, ние сме од македонци од Македонија. И јас ги прашам, ама вие добро да се разбереме, бугари ли сме? Бе како вика ние сме најголемите бугари?
Let me just ask you, kind of straightforward. I mean, what did your grandparents, great-grandparents from that region kind of consider themselves to be in an ethnic sense? Because I know that's always a question as far as that period of time. Do people think of themselves as, you know, ethnic Macedonians, ethnic Bulgarians? You know, how do they view themselves, and how do you view yourself in an ethnic sense?
Yeah, well, you know, first, I'm an American first, right? That's
me too,
obviously. But so, you know, nationality, I'm American, but when I think of my ethnicity, you know, I'm Macedonian, right? But I use the word Macedonian as the region, right? I'm you know, there's people from Macedonia in the Pirin, Vardar, and Aegean, and whether you are Albanian living there, or you're a Vlach or a Greek or a Turk, or you still could be considered a Macedonian by geography. So that's kind of how I view it. My grandfather on my dad's side was very much, you know, Tommy, you're Bulgar Macedonian, right? You're Bulgarian. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he would talk about just his grandfather, his father, saying the same thing to him, right?
Sure.
Remember, you're Bulgarian.
These two identities, Macedonian and Bulgarian, existed hand in hand among Macedono-Bulgarians, and they were practically synonyms. Over time, the strong Macedonian regional identity would grow even stronger, and eventually it would knock out the Bulgarian identity, taking its place as the ethnic and national identity of Macedono-Bulgarians. That process, however, was not just a result of time passing by. There were events that contributed in the shaping of modern Macedonian identity, and I'd argue that the ones who contributed the most happened during the 1910s. Despite the attempts from Imro to establish an autonomous Macedonia, nothing was achieved, and Macedonia remained just an ordinary territory in the then weakened Ottoman Empire. Considering that at that point Turkish lands were pretty much free real estate, the Balkan countries decided to conquer as much land as possible, which was exactly something that happened during the First Balkan War. This war led to tearing apart of Macedonia. I have to say that Bulgaria agreeing to divide Macedonia was most likely the biggest mistake done by Bulgaria when it came to Macedonia, and that's not just my opinion. I don't want to sound like I'm shoving past mistakes into your faces, because I know it wasn't just Bulgaria's fault, and I know that today's Bulgarians are honest and admit that their then governments messed up.
Балканската војна, првата Балканска војна. Бугарскиот цар Фердинанд влегува во договор за поделба на Македонија.
Това може би не е најголемата грешка.
Чекајте бе, каква поделба на Македонија? Какво може Българија да замисли поделба на Македонија?
After the First Balkan War, most of Macedonia was under Greek and Serbian control, which was a problem because Macedonian-Bulgarians who lived there were met with forceful assimilation. Basically, Bulgarian schools and churches were closed, the intellectual class like teachers and priests were killed or forced out, and then the Greeks could incorporate Slavophone Hellenes into their country, and yes, Greeks thought that Bulgarians in Macedonia were actually Greeks who just speak a Slavic language. The same way, the Serbs were convinced that Macedonia was populated by South Serbs who were being Bulgarized by the Bulgarian Exarchate, and so Serbia started to forcibly assimilate Macedono-Bulgarians by sending Serbian teachers, Serbian priests, imposing the Serbian language and banning the Bulgarian language, etc. Aside from Hellenization and Serbianization, a lot of Macedono-Bulgarian families left their homes and moved to Bulgaria in order to escape the new unbearable living conditions, but some were forcibly expelled and had to run to save their lives. After the First Balkan War and the dividing of Macedonia, the Bulgarian government and monarchy decided to go to war against Serbia and Greece to take the rest of Macedonian soil. This decision was a bit unpopular among many Bulgarian soldiers and generals because now they're fighting their allies and they weren't prepared for this war to begin with, which led to a low morale. Also, Serbia and Greece predicted that Bulgaria would attack them, so they made a secret agreement to fight together. That war is today known as the Second Balkan War. And long story short, Bulgaria did not get new territories. Matter of fact, it lost some. And since Macedonia was the ground for that war, there was a lot of destruction and suffering of Macedonians. To make things worse, this happened again during World War I. Yes, Bulgaria did manage to get a lot of territories, and there was a huge Macedonian infantry division within the more huge Bulgarian army, but the side Bulgaria was on lost the Great War, and only around 10% of Macedonia was within Bulgaria's borders. Because of those national catastrophes, Bulgarian Tsar Ferdinand I stepped down and the throne was taken by his son Boris III. Despite the mistakes, these events did not lead to bulgarophobia among Macedonians, who were still pretty close to Bulgarians and still had a Bulgarian ethnic conscious identity. In other words, the tragic events did not lead to Macedonian national separatism yet. While I believe I'd go too far to say Macedonians started hating Bulgaria after World War II, there was still disappointment. Not only that, but after seeing that Macedonia becoming a part of Bulgaria failed and that the new Bulgarian government decided to build friendships with their yesterday's foes, they realized that the only solution for their freedom was a united and independent Macedonian state. The new slogan in IMRO was "Back to the Autonomy," and that motto was accepted by pretty much every single Macedonian revolutionary, regardless of their political views. Basically, they wanted to put the three parts of Macedonia into one single independent Macedonian state. Pirin Macedonia, controlled by Bulgaria, Vardar Macedonia, controlled by the newly established Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, later known as Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and Aegean Macedonia, controlled by Greece. Now, Bulgaria was willing to let go of their part of Macedonia if the Serbs and Greeks would give autonomy to their respective parts of Macedonia. Only problem, they didn't. The process of Serbianization and Hellenization were downright inhumane. You couldn't speak Bulgarian in public, anything written in Bulgarian was banned, you had your family name changed from Ov to Ich or Is, depending under which yoke you were, and to add insult to injury, many Serbs and Greeks moved to Macedonian lands. Greece and Turks had their population exchanges and tens of thousands of Greeks moved to Aegean Macedonia, while in Vardar Macedonia, tens of thousands of Serbs from all the parts of the Yugoslav kingdom moved and received the best lands there, quite literally colonizing what they called Vardarska Banovina. But not everything was stacked against the Macedonians. There was one group of people that was empathetic towards them: communists. The communists were against monarchy in general, and they opposed the oppression done to Macedonians by the ruling class. The Yugoslav Communist Party, consisting of Yugoslavs like Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, Montenegrins, and others, wrote in a few of their reports how the Serbian bourgeoisie was exploiting and oppressing the population of Vardar Macedonia, and so they wanted to give Macedonians autonomy or any form of self-determination. At one point, the Yugoslav communists even wanted to break up Yugoslavia, but that idea was abandoned later when they came up with a plan to take over Yugoslavia and reform it as a socialist state where everyone was equal. And that's what they almost did after World War II ended. Keyword, almost. In the 1920 election, when the Yugoslav Communist Party wasn't banned yet, the support was mostly shown from Macedonia simply because that was the only party that could give them some autonomy. You could see the same situation in Greece, where the only party that wanted to give autonomy for Aegean Macedonia was the Greek Communist Party. There were moments during the interwar period where the Greek Communist Party expressed support for the right for Bulgarian populated areas, i.e. Aegean Macedonia and Western Thrace, to gain independence, which was the most likely reason why that party was disproportionately Slavic in its composition. The overlooked fact, however, was that the biggest supporter of Macedonia, among communists at least, was the Bulgarian Communist Party. Just like other Balkan communists, the Bulgarian communists were very critical of the wars Bulgaria was involved in. They viewed the wars as just a means for the ruling class to expand the power of their countries, and even referred to World War I as an imperialist war. The father of Bulgarian socialism, Dimitar Blagoev, gave a pretty harsh speech in the Bulgarian parliament that sadly is sometimes taken out of context by today's Macedonists. In that speech, Blagoev accused the Bulgarian politicians that they don't care about uniting all Bulgarians, but about conquering lands. I have to clarify that the criticism was not always just directed towards Bulgaria, but towards everyone involved in the 1910s wars, including Serbia, Greece, and others. You see, Balkan communists believed the proper solution for all the people living in the Balkans was a Balkan Federation, a large state in the Balkan Peninsula consistent of all of its regions. Rather than expanding some countries through wars, the Balkan should just avoid conflict and unify all of its regions in their current state into a giant federation. In the case of Bulgaria, its historical regions would be a part of this Balkan Federation rather than Bulgaria as a country. Those regions were Mysia, Thrace, Macedonia, and Dobruja, although some people don't count Dobruja as a territory separate from Mysia. Now, I fully understand why this idea would rub Bulgarians the wrong way, but I have to say that it's a misinterpreted idea. Firstly, there were benefits within that plan. Bulgarians outside of Bulgaria were suffering, so a region that gave them basic human rights would be a big positive. Also, look at the territories on their own. Bulgaria had only 10% of Macedonia. Dobruja was entirely Romanian. So if you ask me, the price Bulgaria would have to pay was quite smaller than the prices of other Balkan nations. Speaking of nations, it's a lie that separate regions like Macedonia, Thrace, and Dobruja automatically meant a separate Macedonian nation, Thracian nation, Dobruja nation, etc. There's zero documents or any other form of evidence that someone advocated for a separate Thracian or Dobrujan nation, and the only reason people believe that lie is because they look at Macedonia and see a Macedonian nation and then come to a conclusion that the same applies to other regions. Yes, I know the communists were the first ones to recognize a separate Macedonian nation, but that recognition came much later than the idea of a Macedonian state. Remember, the term Macedonian was used by revolutionaries from Macedonia to refer to its entire population: Bulgarians, Albanians, Turks, Greeks, you name it. It was simply a regional term. You can look into the documents from communist organizations from the 1920s and see them use the word Macedonians for all the Bulgarians, Greeks, Vlachs, and everybody else living in Macedonia. During that time, Macedonian communists still had a Bulgarian ethnic conscience and viewed the Slavs in Macedonia as Bulgarians. For example, on September 1st, 1927, IMRO United presented a memoir on the Third Congress on National Minorities in Geneva, where they referred to the Macedonian people as a conglomerate of different nations who live in Macedonia. In that same document, they wrote that the Macedonians, particularly Bulgarians, were oppressed by the Serbian and Greek governments, unlike in Pirin, Macedonia, where they had cultural rights. Now, what is this IMRO United I mentioned? It's a result of the schism within the internal Macedonian revolutionary organization. There were ideological battles between some Macedonian revolutionaries and some other Macedonian revolutionaries since the early days of the organization. As time passed by, These ideological battles became more common and bloody, finally reaching its breaking point during the interwar period. Long story short, there were conflicts and killings within Imro after the end of World War I, and at one point the revolutionaries got some sense into them and said, "Hold on, this is stupid. Let's calm down and try to all get along." The attempt to bring all Imro revolutionaries together and stop the fighting resulted in the creation of the May Manifesto on May 6, 1924, a paper that tried to lay the foundation for the path Imro should take, including creating a Macedonian state, working towards a Balkan Federation, fighting against all Balkan monarchies in cooperation with the Soviet Union. Aside from wanting an independent Macedonia, this manifesto was by its nature left-wing, as you can see from his advocating for a Balkan Federation and cooperating with USSR. It was, however, signed by the de facto leader of Imro's right wing, Todor Alexandrov. There are to this very day disputes on whether he actually gave his signature, or his signature was faked, or if he did sign the manifesto and later withdrew his signature. It's all complicated and confusing. What you need to know is that he was murdered because of that signature, and after his murder, all hell broke loose. The left wing and right wing would accuse each other for ordering the assassination of Alexandrov, and the fighting would continue. By fighting, I mean even more ordered assassinations. Following Alexandrov's death, there was a clear divide between the left and right of Imro. Matter of fact, the right wing of Imro was divided itself between Protogerovists, led by Alexander Protogerov, and Mikhailovists, led by Ivan Mikhailov. The leftists of Imro formed a new organization in October of 1925 with the name Imro United. The organization consisted of federalists, communists, and other leftists, and although they had their own dividings, they were nowhere near as strong and especially bloody as the ones seen between Protogerovists and Mikhailovists. The ideology of Imro United was the one already shown the preceding year in the May Manifesto. What's really odd is that, despite the schism of Imro and big animosity between the left-wing and right-wing revolutionaries, when you look at their views and some things they did in practice, they weren't much different. If you take Mikhailovists, for example, who were very anti-communists, they did not want a greater Bulgaria, but an independent Macedonian state for all Macedonians. The Macedonian regional identity played a huge role. Even organizations close to Mikhailov, like the Macedonian Patriotic Organization, which was notorious among ethnic Macedonians for denying the existence of the Macedonian nation and language and insisting they were all Bulgarians, called themselves not Macedonian Bulgarians, but simply Macedonians. Just like during Ottoman rule, the Macedonian name was carried only by its Bulgarian inhabitants, and I'd argue that the dual Macedonian Bulgarian identity was at its peak during the interwar period.
You know, but then on my mother's side, my dedo there was just, he's Macedonian, right? And he kind of, you know, so my grandfather came in 1907 in very different times. My other grandfather, I know he got married in 35. He may have came late 20s, early 30s. Okay. Things were vastly different over there, right? And so I think the identity of just being a Macedonian, because there were no Bulgarian schools anymore, no churches. I mean, it was kind of pushed out.
Right.
And so it was just easier to say Macedonian. And so it's kind of interesting to, I think even back in those days, there was just a simpler approach, even growing up. I'm Macedonian. That, you know, what's your ethnicity? Macedonian.
The Mikhailovists were, like the leftists, at odds with the Bulgarian government and monarchy, especially the one that came to power in 1934 and abolished the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. Even Mikhailov himself wrote numerous articles, books, and letters where he was really and I mean really critical of Bulgarian policy towards Macedonia and the Macedonians. I swear to God, if you think the communists were overly critical towards Bulgaria's government, give Mikhailov's writings a read and it will blow your mind. In essence, when it came to the ideas for solving the Macedonian question and views on who the Macedonians were, there really were no noticeable differences between the left wing and right wing of IMRO. That, however, would change in the 1930s. In June of 1931, Otto Kusinen, a leader in Soviet military intelligence and one of the more prominent leaders of the Comintern, gave a report on the national question to the Executive Committee, where he argued that the main weakness of the Comintern was its underestimating the national question. He noted how communist parties don't bother with the national question by saying how they will work on it after a socialist revolution, but in practice they were passive on that question even after the revolution. Kusinen gave the concept of a Balkan Federation as an example, where the slogan for the right for self-determination until separation was replaced with a purely propaganda slogan for the Balkan Federation, hence why a directive for Balkan communist parties would be sent to gradually abandon the slogan for a Balkan Federation and instead emphasize the right of peoples to self-determination up to secession. This directive did not go unnoticed with IMRO United. In 1932, the members of IMRO United asked themselves one question that up until that point no Macedonian or Bulgarian organization did. Are we Macedonians a separate nation? This question created a discussion in the organization, how the Macedonian revolutionary movement was its own thing, how Macedonia is a separate territory, how they have a unique Slavic dialect, and many other characteristics that can make a group of people be considered a separate nation. And so, IMRO United, through the Bulgarian Communist Party, sent a report to the Comintern that there were conditions for recognizing a Macedonian nation. The report was shown to the Comintern in 1933 by IMRO United member Dino Kjosev, who also was involved in the 1932 discussion on whether there was a Macedonian nation, and then explained to the Comintern the need for recognizing the Macedonian nation. Two high-rank communists, a Czech from Czechoslovakia, Bohumir Šmeral, and a Jew from Poland, Maximilian Horvitz, were hired to create a resolution on the Macedonian question, but were not too familiar with that question, hence why the creation of the resolution was taken in charge by one of the most well-known IMRO United and Bulgarian Communist Party members, Dimitar Vlahov. The creation started on December 20th, 1933 until January 7th, 1934, and finally, on January 11th, 1934, the Comintern adopted the resolution on the Macedonian question and IMRO United, which meant officially recognizing the existence of a separate Macedonian nation and Macedonian language. The first time in history a large international organization did so. I dare to say that this is the most important document in the history of Macedonians. There's before and after the resolution. I'm aware that the decision to recognize a separate Macedonian nation remains to this day a very controversial move among Bulgarians, and I know they consider Bulgarian communists to be traitors because of their help and support for the very idea of a Macedonian nation. Now, I cannot say I don't understand those feelings, but in a sea of negative feedback towards that decision that exists today, I'll be the one voice that will openly say the decision to recognize Macedonians as a separate nation was brilliant and showed how much Bulgarians care about their Macedonian brothers. The Macedonian national identity would be a weapon for achieving many goals. Firstly, the Macedonian nation would serve as a base for a Macedonian state. No one would fight over or control Macedonia if its people are their own thing. That would also mean that Bulgaria wouldn't need to fight for Macedonia and possibly get itself into more national catastrophes. Sure, it would mean separating Macedonian Bulgarians from other Bulgarians, but remember that they already were separated since 1878. Also, by the interwar period, the Macedonian identity was already stronger than Bulgarian because it was used as a middle ground since they couldn't call themselves Bulgarians under Serb and Greek occupation, but also refused to assimilate by calling themselves Serbs or Greeks. That leads me to another point, which is that the Macedonian identity was a tool against Serbianization and Hellenization. If they can't be Bulgarians, then may they be Macedonians. I'm absolutely positive that the resolution on the Macedonian question and its imposing on Balkan communist parties has prevented the Macedonians in Vadra Macedonia from being turned into Serbs, and I'm sure the same would have happened in Greece, where Hellenization would have been stopped if the communists over there came to power. That is, in part, because the Yugoslav Communist Party and Greek Communist Party have accepted the Commentary Resolution and with it the existence of the Macedonian nation. However, aside from their acceptance, they didn't really do anything. That acceptance of theirs came simply from the royalty to the USSR, and while they maintained their position that Macedonians should get the right for self-determination, they didn't even care to help build the Macedonian national identity. Thankfully, that cannot be said for the Bulgarian Communist Party. The power and influence of Bulgarian communists in the communist world were something most socialist countries could only dream of. Some of the highest ranked people in the Comintern were Bulgarians, including Hristo Kapakčiev, Vasil Kolarov, Todor Pavlov, and of course, who could forget Georgi Dimitrov, the most powerful and influential communist at the time of the resolution after Stalin, who chose him to become the head of the Comintern in 1934. It's thanks to their enormous help that the Macedonians were recognized as a separate nation and that the building of their national identity succeeded the recognition. I'm not over-exaggerating when I say there's no Imre United without the Bulgarian Communist Party and Bulgaria. In practice, Imre United functioned as the Macedonian section of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Pretty much every single Imre United member who worked on establishing the Macedonian nation and all of its characteristics were highly ranked members of the Bulgarian Communist Party. The first writings, like articles in newspapers or even books that talk about the Macedonian nation, were printed in Bulgaria's capital city Sofia. Imre United newspapers came out in Sofia, the first circle of Macedonians who wrote the first songs in what would become the Macedonian language was formed there. They had connections across the world, like with the Macedonian migrants in USA, who published articles about the Macedonian nation there and tried to convince the American Macedonians that they were a separate nation. You had a similar situation with Macedonian communists in Yugoslavia who received books from Bulgaria. They didn't have anything like that in Kingdom of Yugoslavia, mostly because the Yugoslav Communist Party couldn't give a damn. Matter of fact, after World War II ended, the communists in the newly established People's Republic of Macedonia had to beg Bulgaria to transfer the Macedonian Scientific Institute and its entire archive from Sofia to Skopje, because in Yugoslavia, Macedonian communists had nothing to work with. Bulgaria not only gladly obliged to transfer the institute, but it also sent the remains of Goce Delchev to Skopje, where he is buried to this day. In case you're not familiar with Goce Delchev, let me tell you that he is the biggest hero of Macedonians, the most well-known and loved revolutionary from Macedonia. If all of this doesn't show you how much Bulgaria loves and cares about Macedonians, I don't know what will. No one has come anywhere close to Bulgaria with the amount of support for Macedonian statehood, Macedonian national identity, and everything else Macedonian. As much praise as I give to Imre United and the Bulgarian Communist Party, I might as well be the last guy on the planet who's saying positive things about them. Their Macedonian policy was still not perfect. There was at least one really big flaw that even I can't defend. This is the part of the video where I have to address the elephant in the room, that elephant being the insanely controversial Macedonian historiography. While there was a narrative among Macedonian communists like Emir United leaders Dimitar Vlahov and Vladimir Poptomov, that Macedonians were Bulgarians, but then went their own way towards their own nation building after the events that started in 1878, a narrative that's actually widely accepted today. It was overshadowed by another narrative that was much more extreme. That narrative followed Macedonism, a doctrine where Macedonians, or to be more precise, the Slavs in Macedonia, were always their own thing and were never Serbs, Greeks, or even Bulgarians. Now, there were different versions of Macedonism before this communist Macedonism, but this form of Macedonism took that doctrine to a whole new level and laid the base for modern Macedonian history that everyone seems to dispute. Basically, this Macedonian historiography claimed that the roots of ethnic Macedonians go back to the 6th century and a Slavic migration to the Balkan Peninsula. The Slavs that arrived to the region of Macedonia formed their own societies and opposed any outside rule, including the one from the Bulgars. A lot of time passed by, and these Macedonian Slavs adopted the name Macedonian for themselves, firstly as regional in the 16th century, then as ethnic, and finally in the mid-19th century as a national identity. Not only did this mean that Macedonians were never Bulgarians, but it also meant taking a part of Bulgarian history and turning it into Macedonian history. If you were a Bulgarian from the Middle Ages that lived in Macedonia, like Tsar Samuel, you were a Macedonian Slav. The same way, if you were a Bulgarian living in Macedonia in the 19th century, like the Miladinov brothers or any revolutionary from Imro, you were an ethnic Macedonian, even if you said you were a Bulgarian. What may shock you is the fact that the original Macedonian ethnic separatists from Imro United have not denied the fact that the Slavs in Macedonia identified themselves as Bulgarians. They just had an explanation why. You see, during the 19th century, when national revivals in the Balkans happened, the Bulgarian national revival started earlier than the Macedonian national revival, and it was more advanced, hence why it was easier for Macedonians to latch onto Bulgarians and work together for their freedom, making the Macedonian national revival look like a part of a larger Bulgarian national revival. For example, both Bulgarians and Macedonians were under threats of Hellenization in the early 19th century, and because Bulgarians were the first ones to open their schools and re-establish their church, Macedonians simply led Bulgarian schools and exarchate into Macedonia to fight Hellenization rather than go through the trouble of opening Macedonian schools or establishing a Macedonian church. Indeed, the Macedonists tried to show a historical continuity that was much longer than it had any right to be. It just seemed dishonest and even manipulative. They would call the Western Bulgarian dialects the Macedonian language and then give the Lozarite as an example of Macedonians writing in the Macedonian language who got in conflict with Stefan Zdabolov's government because of their usage of the Macedonian language. Despite Lozarite denying that they even wanted a separate Macedonian language, let alone used it, Stambolov's government accused them of tearing apart the Bulgarian language, and that was used by Macedonists as evidence that there already was a separate Macedonian language which was banned by Bulgaria and imposed the Bulgarian language on the Macedonians. Now, why were the ethnic separatists from Imro United doing all of this? Well, they were bitter. Remember when we talked about the wars on Macedonian soil during the 1910s and how Macedonia was torn apart again and again, and how afterwards Macedonians ended as second-class citizens in their divided homeland? Well, the countries that fought over Macedonia had claims over its people. Serbia said Macedonians were Serbs, Bulgaria said Macedonians were Bulgarians, and Greece said Macedonians were Slavic-speaking Greeks. You could see many Imro United writings after the Comintern resolution how in order to liberate Macedonia and create a Macedonian state, the Macedonians had to tell the world that they weren't Greeks, Serbs, or Bulgarians, but a separate Macedonian nation. There was also a very critical view of Bulgaria's policy towards Macedonia, mostly because Bulgaria didn't work for an autonomous or independent Macedonia, but tried to annex Macedonia into a larger Bulgarian state, only to fail doing so. Some Macedonists went so far to say how Bulgaria and Vrhovist implanted Bulgarian conscience in Macedonia so it could expand to Macedonian territory, but again, failing to do so. I guess that when you add the situation with the Lozarite, the mistakes of Bulgarian governments have backfired. However, even this harsh criticism didn't originate from bulgarophobic feelings or led to bulgarophobic feelings. What I'm about to say will raise eyebrows, especially of my Bulgarian viewers, but hear me out. The Macedonists from Imru United were not anti-Bulgarian. On the contrary, they were pro-Bulgarian. Despite their claims that they were never Bulgarians, they didn't deny how close Macedonians and Bulgarians were. Their historiography stated many times how these two people worked together throughout history, especially during the 19th century. They stated that their culture and language are just Macedonian. However, they also stated that those were very close to Bulgarian, like Croats and Serbs. For those unaware, the Croatian and Serbian languages were so different that at one point they were considered to be one language, Serbo-Croatian. As for the criticism Macedonian communists had for Bulgaria's politics, it was just that, criticism, not hate. First of all, it was directed at Bulgaria's governments, not the Bulgarian people. Even the biggest critics of Bulgaria's policy on Macedonia have wrote that ordinary Bulgarians were their brothers who were kind to them and welcomed the Macedonian immigrants with open arms. And second of all, criticism wasn't directed just towards Bulgaria. Many articles and books also criticized Greece and Serbia for their conquest of Macedonia, which they viewed as no less unjustified than Bulgarian conquest. They even accused Albania and Romania of having territorial aspirations for Macedonian land. All Macedonian communists wanted was a Macedonian country and to be treated as equal to other Balkan people. They would try to collaborate with the working class of many Balkan nations, but their biggest collaboration was hands down the one with Bulgaria and the Bulgarian Communist Party. The pro-Bulgarian sentiment that was strong at the time, even among Macedonists, wasn't shown just in their words and writings. In 1939, a new conflict would hit Europe and then the whole world. Today, we call that conflict World War II. It would take some time for this war to spread to the Balkans. In October of 1940, Mussolini's army started its invasion of Greece after he previously annexed Albania, which he used as a base for the operation. The invasion was, however, a failure, so Mussolini's pal Hitler decided to get his army involved in order to help the invasion and push the British out of the Balkans. In March of 1941, Hitler forced Bulgaria to sign a pact with the Axis powers and let German troops through its territory. Bulgaria, wishing to stay neutral, signed the pact. Soon, funny mustache man would force the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to sign a pact and to use its territory to move troops to Greece. Yugoslav ruler Prince Paul signed the pact, which turned out to be a very unpopular decision among the Yugoslavs. With help from the British Secret Service, the Yugoslavs organized a coup which may have been bloodless, but still dethroned Prince Paul and cancelled the pact with the Axis. Needless to say, Hitler was furious. On April 6th, the Third Reich invaded and took control over Yugoslavia, which was then divided into many parts. Although Bulgaria wasn't involved in the invasion of Yugoslavia or Greece, Germany gave some territories for Bulgaria to administrate, including most of Macedonia. There were plans of some Macedonians to use this opportunity to create a united Macedonian state, but that's a bit off topic, so I won't get into that. The Macedonians were overwhelmed with joy to see Bulgarian troops arrive. To them, it signified the end of the brutal Serbian and Greek yokes. They viewed Bulgaria occupying their territory as liberation. A huge evidence of Macedonians aching to see Bulgarians come can be seen in a form of what's known as Bulgarian Action Committees. The goal of these committees was to prepare Macedonia for its annexation to Bulgaria. That annexation was supported by both the left-wing and right-wing Macedonians. It was a period of time where Macedonian communists and nationalists from the old days of IMRO worked together for the same goal. One of the two people who started the whole committee thing was Vasil Hadjikimov, a member of IMRO United. The committees, and with that annexation to Bulgaria, was supported by highly ranked Macedonian communists like Strahil Gigov, Panko Brashnarov, and even by the leader of Macedonian communists, Metodi Shaturov Sharlo. Sharlo was the head of a provincial communist organization with the name Regional Committee of Communists in Macedonia. It was basically the Macedonian part of the Yugoslav Communist Party, formed in early 1939, that only a couple of years later became Bulgarian. What I mean by that is that when Macedonia was taken over by Bulgaria in April of 1941, Shaturov and every other member of the regional committee, with the exception of one person who just so happens to be the only non-Macedonian there, voted to detach the regional committee from the Yugoslav Communist Party, cut all ties with the Yugoslav Communist Party, and join the Bulgarian Communist Party. Why wouldn't they do that? Macedonian communism was nothing without Bulgarian communism. The help from Bulgaria they got has strengthened the pro-Bulgarian sentiment among so many Macedonians. It showed the brotherly love between Macedonians and the Bulgarians. However, something very sinister was happening in the background. These actions from Macedonian communists have in a way planted the seeds that would later grow into the anti-Bulgarian propaganda and bulgarophobia we can see today. How, you ask? Well, there was one particular man who saw all of that, and he was not having any of it. Allow me to introduce the main villain of our story, Josip Broz Tito. Tito was a member of the Yugoslav Communist Party since 1920. He soon became a notable member there. More specifically, he was one of the 32 delegates of the Croatian branch of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Because communist organizations were banned in Yugoslavia since 1921, Tito was sent to prison for his activities in 1928, where he stayed until March 16, 1934. Following his release, he rejoined the Yugoslav Communist Party and not long after became its leader. Tito de facto took control over the party by 1937, then he was formally elected its general secretary in 1939 and later its president, a position he'd hold until his death in 1980. But Tito saw himself more than just the party's president. His vision was taking over the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and turning it in a socialist federation, and he becoming its ruler. To show you just how big Josip Broz's ambitions were, I'll quote the words from a conversation between two Yugoslav communists, Vlado Dapčević and Nikola Lekić. In a conversation between these two friends, Lekić told Dapčević that he was very disappointed with what he saw on the 5th conference of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia in 1940. He said, quote, "There was not an iota of democracy at that conference. Everything was prepared and decided in advance. Everyone was chosen according to a list that was made earlier. No one dared to oppose in any case. Tito came to the conference in a worker suit. I don't think there was a man in Yugoslavia who was dressed as well as Tito, all under the pretext of camouflaging himself in front of the class enemy. Imagine that. He came to the conference in a worker's overall. His whole behavior was not first among equals, who should be confirmed or not confirmed by the conference, but of one man for whom we were all just ordinary pawns. Vlado, I have never been more afraid for this party of ours than that time. I got an impression that man, because of his terrible ambitions, will ruin our party. As you can see, Tito saw himself as some sort of god that everyone will bow down to. There is another part of the conversation I will quote to show you another aspect of Tito's character. Tempo allegedly told him that they agreed, in case the Russians sent Dimitrov to the 5th Congress to try to win over delegates from the position of the resolution, to simply prevent him from speaking. With us, Dimitrov had a huge reputation and they were rightfully afraid of such a possibility. The idea was that, if necessary, Tito would turn off the microphone and that, in the worst case, only the 2 or 3 front rows would hear him. When he told me that, I finally broke down. I concluded, this is a piggery and a hostile farm. There is no more confusion. I looked back and I started to realize some things that I didn't pay attention to before. For example, I was invited to visit UDBA members on May 13th, their holiday, and I had the opportunity to see how they were given ranks, decorations, how champagne was poured, how people were simply corrupted. At the time, I was thinking like this. This is a major issue that absolutely leads not only to our break with the Soviet Union, but also with other socialist countries and the international communist movement. So essentially, the Yugoslav Communist Party was taken over by a power-hungry lunatic that expected everyone to obey him. There were other lunatics who did obey him, which sadly included some Macedonians, and no one dared to oppose the lunatics, either because they were a part of that circus or they were too afraid to stand up to them. But there was one star that shined in the darkness. The name of that star was Metodi Shaturov Sharlo. The leader of Macedonian communists, who by the way was ranked higher than Tito in the Comintern, was the only man on that Congress who stood up against Josip Broz and his followers, who we're going to call Titovci. During that time, the goal of your average Macedonian was a Macedonian state. Sharlo, for example, wanted to bring all of Macedonia's pieces back together in a country that would be a Soviet republic, a Soviet Macedonia, so to say. That not only meant close cooperation with the USSR and Bulgarian communists, but also breaking Macedonia from Yugoslavia, even in its socialist form. As you can guess already, that was anything but fine with Tito. That was clear as day after Macedonian communists cut all contact with the Yugoslav Communist Party and joined the Bulgarian Communist Party. In a letter from the Central Committee of the Yugoslav Communist Party addressed to the Macedonian Regional Committee, written on 24th of July 1941, Tito wrote that the activities of Sharlo, or Old Bulgarian as he called them, were anti-party and counter-revolutionary. That's why Macedonian partisans had to start a rebellion against Bulgaria, even if Sharlo, the Old Bulgarian, never gave such order. I have to clarify that Tito wasn't the only one who cynically referred to Sharlo as a Bulgarian. Due to the fact that Metodi Shaturov didn't rebel against everything Bulgarian, Titovci accused him of having a greater Bulgarian spirit, that he viewed Macedonians as Bulgarians and Macedonia as a province of Bulgaria, despite the fact that there were documents that clearly showed Sharlo was a Macedonist. A pro-Bulgarian one, but still a Macedonist. After the fallout between the Macedonian Regional Committee and the Yugoslav Communist Party, Tito would make some laughably bad attempts to bring Macedonian partisans under his wing. He sent some of his men to Macedonia to start an armed rebellion of Macedonian communists against Bulgaria, but no one in Macedonia listened to them. There was some fighting, sure, but it had nothing to do with the Yugoslav Communist Party. I will talk about that fighting and that period of Macedonia's history much more in detail later in this video. You will see why. Then Tito sent some letters to the Comintern and the Bulgarian Communist Party where he cried about Shuttle's anti-party activities, but those letters ended up being valuable as toilet paper. Finally, Tito decided to form an entire new regional committee of communists in Macedonia. Its first chairman was Lazar Kolishevsky, who was later arrested by the Bulgarian police and sentenced to death, after which he had to beg Tsar Boris III for mercy by writing him a letter where he wrote that he's a big Bulgarian like his parents and is loyal to His Majesty and Mother Bulgaria. Credit where it's due, Kolishevsky's plea for mercy worked, as his death sentence was changed to a life in prison sentence. After his arrest, Tito would put Bane Andreev as the leader of the regional committee, but Andreev's policy ended up being bulgarophilic, like Shatorov's. All those attempts by Tito to bring Macedonians to him that failed miserably almost make me feel sorry for him. Almost. Despite the failures, the Titovci would get lucky and actually gain control over the Macedonian partisan movement in 1943, not because of something they did, but because of the events on the northeast. You see, in November of 1942, the Soviet Union started its counterattack on Nazi Germany after it successfully defended its largest cities from the Nazi invasion. As the time passed and the Soviets pushed towards the West more and more, many people across Europe started to realize that, sooner or later, Hitler will lose the war. When it came to Macedonia, the people there feared that World War I would repeat itself. What I mean by that is that Bulgaria got Macedonia in the First World War, but since the side it allied itself with lost, Bulgaria lost Macedonia. Germany was about to lose again, and since the Bulgarian monarchy already had a signed pact with Germany, it would most likely lose the gained territories, like Macedonia. For Macedonians in Vardar Macedonia, that meant the possibility of returning under brutal Serbianization that happened during the interwar period, which wasn't fully successful solely because the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was conquered and divided by the Axis powers. This was a nasty situation where Macedonians had only two options: become South Serbs again or ally with the Yugoslav partisans. Remember how the Yugoslav Communist Party was the only political party that wanted to offer Macedonians a right for self-determination? Well, since the Yugoslav Communists were recognized as the real resistance movement in Yugoslavia by 1943 and were against the Serbian bourgeoisie and monarchy, the Macedonian Communists basically said, "Alright, we'll work with the Yugoslav Communist Party. If that's the only way for us to gain our own state and avoid being forcibly converted into Serbs, then so be it." That was already evident back then. IMRO United member Petar Karchev explained to people back then that Macedonian partisans weren't some Yugoslav agents working against the interests of Bulgarians, but they saw that Hitler, and with him Bulgaria, would lose the war and that Macedonians would return under greater Serbian chauvinism, hence why the Macedonians are grabbing the only idea that could save them: Macedonia for the Macedonians. And so Tito sent his right hand, Svetozar Vukmanović Tempo, to Macedonia in late February of 1943 to form the Macedonian branch of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, which de facto meant putting Macedonian communists under Tito's rule. This led to two things. One, on November 29th and 30th of 1943, the Yugoslav Communist Party made a decision that there will be a Macedonian state within a soon-to-be Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and two, Tempo had started to clean the Macedonian communist circles from what he called opportunist and pro-Bulgarian elements. It is believed that Tempo ordered the assassinations of Macedonians that sided with Bulgaria instead of Yugoslavia, like Metodi Shatorov Sharlo. Indeed, there were some mysterious deaths among Macedonian partisans in 1943 and 1944. While it's unknown to this day who killed them or ordered their killings, considering Tempo admitted later in his life that he got rid of pro-Bulgarian elements, it's safe to assume the assassinations were ordered by Tito through his proxy Tempo. Eventually, as Hitler was losing the war, so did his troops in Yugoslavia, although some of the troops simply pulled out to fight the Soviets. There was an Axis line formed in October of 1944 that acted as a fortification for retreating German troops. That defense line is today known as the Sirmian Front. The Yugoslav Communist Party wanted Macedonian partisans to join the fight on the Sirmian Front, but Macedonians wanted to go south towards Aegean Macedonia to fight alongside the Greek Communist Party and maybe get the autonomy of Aegean Macedonia the Greek Communists promised. Tempo was sent again to put things in order, and after his harsh words and even more killings, the 15th Macedonian Corps was sent to the Sirmian Front in January of 1945. Macedonians weren't the only ones who helped Yugoslav partisans. Help also came from the Soviet Red Army and the Bulgarian Army, where the Bulgarian Army was under control of the Bulgarian Communist Party ever since it came to power in Bulgaria on 9th of September 1944. Tito even sent a letter to Bulgarian soldiers thanking them for their help in liberating Skopje, Štip, Niš, Veles and other places. On April 12, 1945, the Sirmian Front was finally broken, and with that, fascism in the Balkans was defeated. After the war, it seemed like things were going excellent for the Macedonians. They got their own republic within Yugoslavia, the process of Serbian assimilation did not return, as now they were recognized as a separate Macedonian nation in the new socialist Yugoslavia. Tito hoped that he'd get Macedonians to like him by giving them a state and recognition, and he did. Macedonians praised him for those things. Sure, he kinda did that by force by making a law that forced you to identify as Macedonian instead of Bulgarian, like it or not. But it was still better than what was in Yugoslavia ruled by the Karađorđević dynasty. Similar things were happening in socialist Bulgaria. Under Georgi Dimitrov, Pirin Macedonia received cultural autonomy, and the Macedonians there were recognized as a nation separate from Bulgarians. They even allowed IMRO United members to implement Macedonian history in schools in Pirin Macedonia. I'm fully aware those are super controversial moves in today's Bulgaria, but regardless, it showed that Bulgaria was strongly supporting the Macedonian identity, Macedonian right for self-determination, Macedonian unification, etc. All of this was done partially because, with the Bled Agreement, Bulgaria and Macedonia will unite in one South-like federation, where Yugoslav Macedonia will unite with Bulgarian Macedonia, and in return, Bulgaria will receive Western Outlands, which are territories given to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes after World War I. It looked like a wonderful period was finally ahead of Macedonians. They were no longer oppressed, you had governments that worked in favor of your unification, the things were going great for the Macedonians. Or so it seemed. Despite the recognition, the relations between the People's Republic of Macedonia and the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which it was a part of, were anything but stable. It became clear right away that the interests of Macedonians and Titovci were quite different. You see, even before the victory of communism in the Balkans, the position of Macedonians was peace and unity between all Balkan nations, especially Slavs. The Macedonians would act as a unifying link for South Slavs. They carried the idea of peace and brotherhood between all Slavs in the Balkans. You could only imagine their happiness when that brotherhood was not that far away. Unfortunately, Tito didn't view things that way. The new ruler of Yugoslavia, with a god complex, thought that Macedonians weren't loyal to him and his state. He scapegoated the pro-Bulgarian sentiment of Macedonians for their supposed disloyalty. It wasn't good enough to like both Dimitrov and him and like both Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. You wanted to be a good Yugoslav and Titoist? You couldn't be a Bulgarophile. If the anti-Bulgarian feelings of Tito and Titovci weren't already obvious back in '41 when they belittled Šarlo by calling him an old Bulgarian, then they definitely were obvious when Tito came to power, so much so that he and his servants got in conflict with even the biggest Macedonists at the time. How about we start with a man named Vasil Ivanovski? This man was one of the pioneers of modern Macedonian identity. As a member of the Central Committee of IMRO United, Ivanovsky wrote the very first articles in Bulgaria that talked about a separate Macedonian nation, i.e. Macedonians being something different from Bulgarians. He was one of the 3 people behind Emir United newspaper, Makedonski Vesti, and he founded Nova Makedonia, the first newspaper in Macedonia. As you can see, he was a pretty big deal. Because of his communist activities, Vasily Ivanovsky was arrested in Bulgaria and then transferred to a prison camp in Idrizovo, Macedonia during World War II. When the tide of the war turned in favor of communists, Ivanovsky was freed and decided to stay in the newly formed People's Republic of Macedonia to work on the Macedonian question, only to return to Bulgaria in November of 1945 because of what he called political reasons. A little later, he revealed what he meant by political reasons. Ivanovsky was very critical towards the Yugoslav Communist Party for their Macedonian policy. Firstly, he attacked Milovan Djilas, a well-known Yugoslav communist, for being against celebrating the anniversary of the Ilinden uprising because it was a Bulgarian uprising. Some other Macedonian communists wrote that the Ilinden uprising anniversary was not celebrated because Titovci viewed it as something Bulgarian. Ivanovsky would also attack Djilas for his comments on Nova Makedonia. That newspaper was in the Macedonian language, but when Djilas saw it, he said, "What kind of Bulgarian newspaper is this?" It was written that Yugoslav communists were afraid of the ethnic and language closeness between Macedonians and Bulgarians. They thought that the more they pushed the cultural and political relations Macedonians had away from Bulgaria, the more strong relations Macedonians would have with the nations of Yugoslavia. As a result of those fears, the newly codified Macedonian language and alphabet were artificially brought closer to the most spoken language of Yugoslavia, the Serbo-Croatian language. The Macedonian alphabet ended up being almost identical to Karadzica, the Cyrillic script for Serbo-Croatian, something that one of the pioneers of Macedonian literature, Venko Markovski, was heavily against and even kicked out of the party for his opposition. The Macedonian language itself was forced to look closer to Serbo-Croatian by taking words from the Serbo-Croatian language and putting them in the Macedonian language, despite some of the words never being used by Macedonians before the codification. Not only did this all mean pushing away the Macedonian language from the Bulgarian language, but the Macedonian language looked quite different from the original Macedonian dialect it was based on. Many documents point out that the Macedonians couldn't understand their own language. One entire nation did not know their own language. Just imagine how messed up and horrifying that sounds. Vasily Ivanovsky wrote that many Macedonian communists were complaining about the decisions but were under heavy pressure and hence kept quiet about their complaints. They were even accused as Bulgarians and spied on by OZNA, which was the Department for People's Protection that was shortly after its foundation replaced by KOS and UDBA. But the most horrifying part of this Yugoslav agenda to create a barrier between Macedonia and Bulgaria is the fact that there were Macedonians who supported and engaged in that agenda. Ivanovsky mentioned a Macedonian Titoist who agreed with Milovan Djilas on the Ilinden uprising and it not being celebrated because it was a Bulgarian uprising. His name was Lazar Kolishevsky. Kolishevsky also rejected the revolutionary work of Goce Delchev, arguably the biggest revolutionary from Macedonia of all time, because he was, I quote, just some Bulgarian without importance for Macedonia. As you can imagine, Kolishevsky was under fire from other Macedonians for his views on Ilinden uprising and Delchev, after which he accepted that event and historical figure, but as something exclusively Macedonian. This tactic of simply removing the Bulgarian name from past events and people will later be seen much more frequently. However, Lazar Kolishevsky wasn't the only Macedonian who blindly followed Yugoslav's politics. Although a minority, Macedonian Titovci would expose themselves as a serious threat to Macedono-Bulgarian relations almost immediately after World War II. The anti-Bulgarian sentiment was called out all the way back in 1949 when Petso Trajkov, a Macedonian communist, published his book The Nationalism of Skopje's Governors. Aside from criticizing Tito, Tempo, Gilas, and other Yugoslavs, this book attacked the representatives of the Central Committee of the Macedonian Communist Party for their bulgarophobia. For example, he wrote that Vera Atseva was filled with unhidden hatred for everything Bulgarian, and that Mitko Zafirov changed his last name to Zafirovsky so it wouldn't have anything in common with the hated Bulgarian Ov surname ending. Under the rule of people like them, the borders between Macedonia and Bulgaria were closed, the contributions of the Bulgarian Communist Party during World War II were dismissed, most Bulgarians weren't allowed to visit Macedonia, and anything written in Bulgarian, even communist newspapers and issues dedicated to Macedonian heroes, were forbidden in Tito's Macedonia.
А ние во втората половина на 80-тите татко ми значи бугарските книги во рафтот со книги ги држаше вака. Значи од оваа страна. Не вака. Да. Значи колку татко ми не беше некој плашлив човек, да се разбереме. Значи јас кога го прашав зошто, тој ми одговори кога јас сакав една да ја вратам кратка историја на Българија беше дојдена од дедо ми на мајка ми, таткото, кога почина ние библиотеката му ја наследив, тој ми рече врати ја како си ја нашол, инаку и ти и јас во затвор ќе завршиш.
These accusations, which are not limited to the things I just mentioned, were also written in works of other Macedonian communists and Imer United members like Dino Kjosev and Kosta Lamprev. It is unclear what created the bulgarophobic feeling among Macedonian Titovci, but based on all the information available, their careers played a big role. Let's take a look at Mihailo Apostolski, a man that went back and forth between pro-Yugoslav and pro-Bulgarian policy. When Bulgaria took over Macedonia in 1941, Apostolski asked to join the Bulgarian army as an officer, a rank that he held in the Yugoslav army. Bulgaria would offer him to join its army, but as a captain, which was one rank lower than officer. Apostolski got mad and decided to instead join the partisans, where Tito gave him the rank of Major General. This man would later attack Bulgaria in his books and interviews. It was people like him that would soon take over Macedonia and make bulgarophobia its official policy. What I'm saying to you is that there was an active and conscious effort to destroy Macedono-Bulgarian relations and the pro-Bulgarian sentiment within Macedonia. The pro-Bulgarian Macedonians, who were a majority, were quiet due to fear from Tito and Titovci, but you're probably wondering what would actually happen if they stood up against the Yugoslav Communist Party. I'd like you to meet the first president of Macedonia. His name was Metodija Andonov Cento. Cento got in conflict with Titovci even before the war ended, and it certainly didn't get any better after the war. Due to that conflict with the Yugoslav Communist Party and them slowly taking away his authority, Metodija Andonov was resigned from his position as Macedonia's president in 1946. Shortly after, he was arrested by the Yugoslav authorities under accusation that he wanted to illegally cross the border into Greece. Now, that was the accusation, but in reality, Cento was so dissatisfied with Tito's Yugoslavia that he wanted to break away Macedonia from Yugoslavia and join it with Bulgaria. That plan existing was confirmed by his secretary Katerina Trajkova-Nurđieva.
Секретар съм на първи секретар съм на първия министър-председател Методия Андонов Ченто на Македония. Това може да се провери. Аз съм гостенин на Торонто. Ето е плакетата. Само на мене и на министър-председател, който Дойде след първия министър, го обвиниха за това, защото неговото становище беше Македония да премине не към федеративна Югославия, а към България. Това беше, осъдиха го на 11 години робия, 9 години издържа, умря човека. И аз имам, ето ги филмите тук.
So far, we have seen this anti-Bulgarian policy being opposed by everyone from the pioneer of modern Macedonism to the first president of Macedonia. But believe it or not, things are going to become even worse. The peak of Macedono-Yugoslav conflict started in 1948. That was the year of the infamous Tito-Stalin split. Long story short, the interests of Stalin and the interests of Tito were far from the same. For example, Stalin agreed with Western powers that Greece will be in the Western sphere of influence, but Tito decided to be a smartass and sent his troops to Greece to make Greek communists start an armed rebellion in order to take over the country. That was done in hopes that he'll get his hands on Aegean Macedonia and make a united Macedonia within Yugoslavia. The overly ambitious marshal also wanted to incorporate Albania and Bulgaria into a larger Yugoslavia with him as its almighty ruler. Eventually, after many disagreements, the Comintern published a resolution on June 28, 1948, where it criticized the Yugoslav Communist Party for its anti-Soviet policy. Tito was in a way found in a situation where he had to stop with his disobedience, or he would no longer be supported by the USSR. Tito chose not to obey Stalin, and so the Tito-Stalin split happened, making Yugoslavia the first socialist country to break away from Soviet influence. This resulted in a mini Cold War between the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the Eastern Bloc, which of course included Bulgaria. The following 5 years, which made what today is called the Infobiro period, were filled with eliminating people deemed to be Stalinists or Titoists, depending on whether we're talking about Yugoslavia or the Eastern Bloc. After cutting ties with the East, Tito decided to ask the United States of America for financial support. America agreed to help, but under condition that Yugoslavia stops all support for communists in Greece, which Tito accepted. Now the borders were closed between Vardar and Aegean Macedonia, and the partisans in Greece couldn't count on any help, despite the fact that Tito decided to get involved there and start an armed rebellion of Greek communists. These actions made Tito look like a sellout to the capitalist West in the eyes of the Eastern Bloc countries. Bulgaria, being a part of the bloc, abandoned the idea of unification mentioned in the Bled Agreement, and also abolished the cultural autonomy that it gave to Pirin Macedonia. However, it still recognized an ethnic Macedonian population there. Here's the thing. When the Bulgarian Communist Party took control over Bulgaria, it planned to unify Vardar and Pirin Macedonia by recognizing the separate Macedonian nation in its part of Macedonia. Since the population in Yugoslav Macedonia was recognized as a separate Macedonian nation, it was logical that the same would be done in Bulgarian Macedonia in order for the unification to work. Admittedly, the recognition of Macedonians in Pirin Macedonia was a very controversial move, since it's debatable if the Macedono-Bulgarians there went through the same processes as Macedono-Bulgarians in Aegean Macedonia and Vardar Macedonia, and the fact that the people in Pirin Macedonia weren't even asked if they wanted to be ethnic Macedonians, as confirmed in documents made at the time that gave instructions how and who to turn into Macedonians by nationality. While Bulgaria stopped implementing Macedonian language and history classes in Pirin schools, it still recognized ethnic Macedonians there even after the Tito-Stalin split, in hopes that the two parts of Macedonia will unite within Bulgaria's borders. The Soviet Union supported Bulgaria in the idea that Macedonia should be a part of the Bulgarian state. As for Yugoslavia, the once supported plan to have a united Macedonian state within Yugoslav borders was not only abandoned after the Tito-Stalin split, but was also discouraged as much as possible. It did, however, try to send agents to Pirin, Macedonia, in hopes they could break that region away from Bulgaria and incorporate it within Yugoslavia by joining it to the People's Republic of Macedonia. So in a nutshell, both Bulgaria and Yugoslavia were for the unification of two Macedonias, as long as that unified Macedonia will be theirs. The most important question here is, what did the Macedonians themselves want? The dissatisfaction Macedonians had with Tito's Yugoslavia was skyrocketing, so much so that Macedonia was the only part of Yugoslavia that the Yugoslav Communist Party didn't have under control. Aside from then viewing Tito as a traitor for breaking the promise of uniting all parts of Macedonia, the abysmal policy of anti-Bulgarianism that was seen after World War II became even worse after the split. Two highly ranked Macedonian communists, Panko Brashnarov and Pavel Shatev, wrote a letter to the Bulgarian Communist Party explaining the unbearable situation in the Macedonian Republic. Everything Macedonian was mocked and forbidden. You couldn't sing Macedonian songs without being accused of being a nationalist. It got to the point where the unofficial IMRO anthem, Rise, Dawn of Freedom, which was actually used as the anthem of the People's Republic of Macedonia, was banned in 1948 for being bulgarophobic. If you haven't realized already, the banning of stuff considered to be Bulgarian or bulgarophilic wasn't just anti-Bulgarian, but also anti-Macedonian. So when Macedonian communists heard of the Inforbiro resolution and the wish of the USSR and Bulgaria to incorporate Macedonia into the Bulgarian state, there was a moment of overwhelming joy. This seemed like a good opportunity for Macedonians to declare independence from Yugoslavia and join Bulgaria. Only problem, Tito wasn't going to allow it. Any Macedonian who publicly approved the resolution was thrown in prison camps. This cleaning of the Macedonian Communist Party completely changed its structure. To prove my point, here's a picture of the first Macedonian government. And here's a picture of that same government after Tito's cleaning. As you can see, is a huge difference. This is just the government. There were many more Macedonian communists who were sentenced to lengthy prison sentence for their support of the Inforbiro resolution. All of these people were removed from power by Tito's regime under accusations that they were autonomists, nationalists, separatists, and Bulgarophiles. If you were lucky, you could escape to Bulgaria, or you'd simply have to keep your mouth shut unless you state publicly that you're against the resolution. With this cleaning of the Macedonian Communist Party, the pro-Bulgarian element was completely removed from power in Macedonia. But the communists weren't the only ones who fell victim under Tito's wrath. Ordinary Macedonians who couldn't stand the situation tried to make plans that could lead to Macedonia's independence. Such plan was created by 5 students from Strumica aged from 18 to 23. They're today referred as the Strumicas 5, and their names were Mirko Pecev, Georgi Yarnov, Boris Belev, Georgi Kosturanov, and Stevo Topchev. On August 13, 1951, the 5 young men were brutally beaten to death by communist authorities near Dorlombos, a village around Strumica. The official explanation for their killings was that they tried to illegally pass the border to get to Greece. Boy, does that sound familiar. But no one from Strumica believed in that explanation. Instead, the students were kidnapped and murdered because they wanted to recreate the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, which obviously signified a plan to make Macedonia an independent state. Thousands of people attended the funerals of the Strumicas 5, and the malicious effort to prevent them from coming to those funerals were unsuccessful. One doctor examined the corpses and discovered that the young men were firstly mistreated and then shot from a short distance. With brutality like that, any wish for independence, just like the already mentioned pro-Bulgarian feelings, were crushed violently. You will bow to the Yugoslav overlord or perish. After Stalin's death in March of 1953, there was an attempt to rebuild the relationship between Yugoslavia and the Eastern Bloc. While the situation was a little better, it was still far from good. The only time you could say Yugoslavia had somewhat of a good relationship with Bulgaria and other Eastern Bloc countries was in the 1970s and especially 1980s. In the meantime, a lot of stuff happened. Even after Stalin's death, there were no steps taken to fulfill the Bled Agreement. Once it became apparent that there won't be a unification of Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, and with that, the unification of Vardar and Pirin Macedonia, the Bulgarian government neutralized the Macedonization process it implemented in its Macedonia. Now, the undoing of Macedonization in Pirin Macedonia was done in 3 acts. The first act was abolishing the cultural autonomy in 1948 after the Tito-Stalin split, something we already talked about. The second act was abolishing the very process of Macedonization in 1958. However, Bulgaria still allowed the inhabitants of Pirin Macedonia to declare themselves whatever they wanted, and many of them still identified as ethnic Macedonians. Despite then being given a choice, a lot of people there were like, well, you did kind of turn us into ethnic Macedonians, so I guess that's my identity now. So, in 1963, the Bulgarian Communist Party held a plenum of its Central Committee, which in the story is the third act of Macedonization's abolishment. On this plenum, the Bulgarian government officially declared that the population of Pirin Macedonia is Bulgarian, and with that, there were no ethnic Macedonians there. A lot of Macedonians today blame the then Bulgarian president Todor Zhivkov for ending the Macedonian question in Bulgaria by simply removing the recognition of ethnic Macedonians in Pirin Macedonia. But I want you to take a look at IMRO United members who worked on the Macedonian nation.
Ликвидирахме културната автономия и стана българска земя.
Every IMRO United member in Bulgaria stopped calling themselves Macedonians. Asen Tarakčev, Venko Markovski, Vladimir Poptomov, Tushe Vlahov, and many more who built the Macedonian identity during the 1930s and 1940s now say they're Bulgarians and speak out against Yugoslav Macedonia. The removal of ethnic Macedonian identity actually made sense, since it was pointless to make the population of Pirin Macedonia ethnically Macedonian when it won't unite with Macedonians in Yugoslav Macedonia and Yugoslav Macedonia itself. Unfortunately, there was one mistake the Bulgarian Communist Party made when they ended Macedonization. They decided to completely distance themselves from the building of the Macedonian nation by Bulgaria. All of the help Bulgaria gave to Macedonians was removed from history. What they couldn't run away from was simply called a mistake, and the official position Bulgaria took on the Macedonian nation was that it was invented in 1945 by Tito and the Yugoslav Communist Party. This ended up backfiring because Macedonians ended up praising Tito for recognizing the Macedonian nation, making a Macedonian state, ending Serbianization of Vardar Macedonia, etc. Basically, Tito, possibly the biggest anti-Macedonian of all time, is even today taking credit for what Bulgaria fought for tooth and nail, and sadly, to this day, Bulgaria is still ignoring its role in the Macedonian ethnogenesis.
Тука доаѓаме сега до една фаза кај што јас апсолутно не се слугасам и тој им го кажав у Софија, дека македонската нација е формирана од Тито и од комунистите 45-та година и тоа барат дори во документ да влезе.
Така е Захариева, например.
Сега и Захариева и дури официјална политика име тоа. Јас сметам дека тука бугарската историографија прави едно алиби на собствената на собствените ако да ги наречеме грешки, ја не мислам дека се грешки, туку тоа е многу рационална политика, а од друга страна Пак на Југословенската комунистичка партија тоа долго време им одговараше и до денеска на многу им одговара кога ќе кажат Тито е најглавниот кој ја создал македонската нација. Има во Македонија луѓе кои живеат во Тито.
Still, all of that does not excuse the behavior shown by Macedonian communists after the 1963 plenum. During Ottoman rule of the Balkans, there was a saying that a Turkified Balkaner was worse than an actual Turk. Something like that could be said about Macedonian Titovci. By 1963, Macedonia was under total control of Macedonians loyal to Tito. Anything resembling pro-independence, Bulgarian or pro-Bulgarian was removed a long time ago. While Tito kept his position that the USSR and Bulgaria didn't help the Yugoslav partisans during World War II, despite the fact that he wrote a letter thanking the Bulgarian army for their contribution in fighting off the Nazis, most of the anti-Bulgarian sentiment in Yugoslavia came from Macedonia. Even the indoctrination in Macedonia against Bulgaria was done by Macedonians to Macedonians. That is probably the saddest thing in our story. After just one or maybe two generations of Macedonians in Tito's Yugoslavia, the Macedonians went from being overly pro-Bulgarian to overly anti-Bulgarian. Now, it was seen so far how the pro-Bulgarian element was destroyed, but how did Macedonians become actively anti-Bulgarian? The anti-Bulgarian propaganda in Yugoslav Macedonia was very complex, but it was based around two things: nationality and history. Following the already mentioned 1963 plenum of the Bulgarian Communist Party, Macedonian Titovci were outraged that Bulgaria started to deny the Macedonian nation. Their outrage was based on a false accusation, however. The thing is, Bulgaria stopped recognizing ethnic Macedonians within itself only, not in the Socialist Republic of Macedonia. Bulgaria didn't deny the existence of the Macedonian nation in Yugoslavia. Matter of fact, Živkov stated in his speech on the plenum that there was a Macedonian nation, albeit in Yugoslavia and after 1944. It seemed that his words were not acknowledged, as Macedonian Titovci started making a strawman argument that Bulgarians were completely denying the existence of Macedonians everywhere. This led to another false accusation. The Bulgarians are denying that the Macedonian nation exists because they want to recreate San Stefano, Bulgaria, and assimilate Macedonians. It's funny how this Greater Bulgaria, for which Macedonians started a 6-month uprising to get back, is now seen as anti-Macedonian. I say is because accusing Bulgaria of having irredentist claims over Macedonia is going on to this day. To make things more ridiculous, this Yugoslav anti-Bulgarian propaganda is now spouted by the kind anti-nationalist progressives, who compare Bulgaria's EU veto to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and who admit that Bulgaria was the first country to recognize Macedonia's independence, but still pull off mental gymnastics to convince us that Bulgaria wants to conquer Macedonia. Good thing Macedonians have their support. Now they can bravely fight Bulgarian assimilation by being forced to speak Albanian, listening to Serbian music, and waving flags with a Greek symbol. One famous YouTuber literally said that Macedonians cannot recognize their Bulgarian roots because it will open doors for Bulgarian irredentism. So the simple act of stating historical truth, or trying to find and recognize historical truth, is an existential threat. Speaking of history, the Macedonian historiography in Tito's Yugoslavia was formed to be one part non-Bulgarian and other part anti-Bulgarian. Macedonian history in Socialist Yugoslavia was a copy of the Macedonist historiography created by Imre United during the 1930s, but it was modified so much that any connection with Bulgarians was simply removed. By the 1960s, the formation of the Macedonian nation, which started in 1878, was completed. The only thing left was to give a proper and honest explanation of the separation of Macedonians from the Bulgarian nation and the evolution of Macedonian-Bulgarian into simply Macedonian. After all, it was a fact that the Slavic population of Macedonia from the 19th century identified as ethnic Bulgarians. While some Imur-United members desperately struggled to disprove that Macedonian Slavs are Bulgarians, at least they had the common decency and honesty to admit that everyone from the Miladinov brothers to Goce-Delchev identified as Bulgarians. No such honesty was seen among Titovci. What they did was take an original Bulgarian text and translate it to Macedonian except the word Bulgarian. If they didn't do that, then they would simply replace Bulgarian with Macedonian.
Историографијата беше во функција на градење на нацијата и никој во Македонија не опонираше на ставовите на нашите историчари. Никој, тие имаа слобода во бирањето на документите.
Има друга мисија.
Има друга мисија, така. И тука ние треба малку да погледнеме похрабро кон тоа.
Сега не треба да се плашиме, не е комплексна на помала.
Само така е. Ако погледнеме похрабро на тоа, ние ќе си ја зголемиме самодовербата. Да, тоа е пат по кој нашата нација е изградено и ние од тоа не треба да се плашиме. Таа нација е изградена и имало во минатото, во градењето на таа нација некои работи кои не биле во ред во однос на академската наука, во однос на некои прашања кои биле или тргани на страна или селективно бирани, и на документи имало правење и на фалсификати, и тоа треба да се каже. Наместо бугарин пишува македонец, некои од историчарите пишувале така, сметале дека тоа е во функција и тоа треба да се
признае. Имате проблеми, дали сте единствени?
Not only did this debulgarize Macedonian history completely, but it also spat on Macedonian heroes and their identity. Remember, anything written in Bulgarian was punishable by law to own in Socialist Macedonia. So instead of reading originals, you had to settle for Macedonian translations that lied to you. This led to situations that would have been hilarious if they weren't tragic. For example, Macedonian revivalists Dimitar and Konstantin Miladinov wrote a book in 1861 titled Bulgarian Folk Songs. The re-releases of that book were titled Proceedings of Miladinovs. This version of the book was released so many times that Macedonians straight up forgot or never even knew to begin with what the original name of the book was.
Овие народните песни на браќата Миладиновци. Да. Каков е официјалниот назив на таа книга?
Така како што е.
Бугарски народни песни.
Така е.
Зашто ние не ги пишеме у нашите учебници дека се бугарски народни песни?
Because the Macedono-Bulgarian identity of the 19th and early 20th century was relegated to just Macedonian in Macedonia and just Bulgarian in Bulgaria. We ended up with two countries who claim one history and accusing each other of stealing their history. Once again, this was a reason for further claims that Bulgaria is denying the existence of the Macedonian nation, that Bulgaria has irredentist claims, etc. One side viewed the other as a Yugoslav Communist Party invention and is denying its role in others' ethnogenesis, while the other side is frantically defending its identity from the first side and denying having the same roots. The people who were the biggest brothers just 20 years ago were now the biggest enemies. It pains me to say that the situation today isn't different from what it was 60 years ago. The once powerful brotherhood has disappeared a long time ago. Its place was taken by fear. Fear of losing identity, fear of losing history, fear of assimilation, fear of irredentism, and all the other fears together have not only pushed the Macedonians away from everything Bulgarian, but it also created a deep, intense hate towards Bulgaria and the Bulgarian people. Tito won. He destroyed the pro-Bulgarian sentiment and made the people loyal to him. Even over 30 years after Yugoslavia's death and over 40 years after Tito's death, the Macedono-Bulgarian relations have still not recovered. If anything, the ideology of Titovci is still alive today.
Во Македонија се уште постои шовинизам према се што се нарекува пријателство со Бугарија. Ние имаме тежок индоктринацијски проблем во Македонија кога станува збор за Бугарија. Значи, тоа е, мислам, јавна тајна, го гледаме сите. Нашите луѓе се чипирани од мали преку системот на образование, преку системот на медиуми, се чипирани да ја мразат Бугарија. И тоа е, кога ги слушате нивните аргументи дека тоа мора да престане, тоа е реално така.
As horrible as all these things sound, believe it or not, we have yet to talk about the peak of Yugoslav anti-Bulgarianism. A lot of countries built a past on their identity on the base of some glorious battle from the past. Not surprisingly, the identity of Yugoslavs was built on their battle during World War II. After all, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was controlled by communists, and the fascist forces from World War II were their greatest enemy. I know that claim is very debatable, but I won't get into that in this video. There were many documentaries and books in Macedonia that talked about Macedonia during World War II, but they were structured in a way that the struggle of Macedonians seemed more anti-Bulgarian than anti-fascist. Indeed, the Macedonian presentation of Macedonia during World War II was bulgarophobic to the core, and I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that this is some of the most vile and lying propaganda I've ever seen. Although numerous, the documentaries and books about Macedonians in World War II follow the same formula. They start by taking us back to April of 1941, when Vardar Macedonia was taken over by Albania, which was an Italian protectorate at the time, and Bulgaria. If you're lucky, you might hear the documentaries mention Italian, Albanian, and German fascists that were stationed in Macedonia during World War II, and that's about it. They're just mentioned in one or two sentences, and the role ends there. The entire focus is on Bulgarian fascists and their occupation. A notorious term is used in the documentaries and in general discussions to describe Bulgaria's administration of Macedonia. Bulgarian fascist occupier. It's a painfully overused term you can see everywhere in Macedonia. We're gonna analyze that label because the meaning is a bit ambiguous. Sometimes you'll see Macedonians point out how the Bulgarian government used the verb to occupy in their documents that dealt with their administration of Macedonia. That is because the Bulgarians were using the definition of the word occupy, which is taking control of a place by military conquest. By definition, yes, Bulgaria did occupy a large piece of Macedonia. However, in the context of Macedonian Titoist historiography, Bulgarian occupation meant much more than just controlling a piece of land. This occupation was painted as not different from the Serb and Greek occupation. Matter of fact, even some Western historians make a mistake that one brutal regime was simply replaced with another. That rhetoric was created by unjustifiably adding the national element in the story. Some people, particularly some Bulgarians, may disagree with me when I say that there was a widespread and strong Macedonian identity in 1941. I already talked about how the interwar period was a time when the Macedonian identity defeated the Bulgarian identity, and how Macedonian Bulgarians started to refer to themselves as simply Macedonians, especially the communists who identified as Macedonians by nationality. None of that means that the fighting in Macedonia during World War II had anything to do with nationality. What the Titovci would do is they'd remove any trace of the pro-Bulgarian sentiment seen in 1941. Footage showing Macedonian delightfully greeting Bulgarian troops was nowhere to be seen. Bulgarian action committees were deleted from history, and the joining of the Macedonian Regional Committee to the Bulgarian Communist Party was omitted as well. Instead, the documentaries would talk about Macedonian Titovci, led by Lazar Kolishevsky, and how they started the rebellion of Macedonian partisans against Bulgarian occupiers, making the Macedonian struggle a part of a larger Yugoslav national liberation struggle. That, of course, was utter nonsense, considering that the Yugoslav Communist Party had zero influence in Macedonia, at least in the first couple of years. Now, what were Macedonian partisans fighting against? According to Yugoslav Macedonia's historiography, all the millions of levs and schools Bulgaria opened in Macedonia were nothing more than a part of Bulgaria's plan for assimilation of Macedonians. You apparently couldn't identify as Macedonian or use the Macedonian language in school, and that meant Bulgarization, something Macedonians opposed. If this claim is true, then can someone please explain to me why did Macedonian communists identify as Bulgarian during the occupation and never complained about it? Can someone explain why was the Bulgarian language a problem when pretty much every Macedonian used it before the Macedonian language was standardized in 1945? Someone please explain why there are zero documents from 1941 to 1944 where some Macedonian, doesn't matter who, argued that the Bulgarians were trying to Bulgarize the Macedonians. The huge lie that the battle in Macedonia during World War II had anything to do with nationality has built the image of the war being Macedonians versus Bulgarians. This anti-Bulgarian black and white narrative became much more malicious when another label was placed on the Bulgarians: fascist. The discussions and debates on whether the government under Tsar Boris III was fascist, monarcho-fascist, or pro-fascist are still happening to this day, especially in Bulgarian intellectual circles. Matter of fact, the term Bulgarian fascist was firstly used by Bulgarian communists for the Bulgarian government and the right-wing factions of the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. Now, to determine whether the Bulgarian government during World War II was fascist, we can't simply go by definition of what fascism is, because if we did, then only Benito Mussolini and his servants would count as fascist. Technically, not even Adolf Hitler was a fascist, instead he was a National Socialist. The historians, however, wanted to keep things simple, and so any far-right authoritarian government or political party was placed under one fascist umbrella. Granted, the term lost a lot of its meaning in the past 10 years, but that's a whole other topic. If you would go with facts that Bulgaria allied itself with Nazi Germany and had anti-Semitic laws copied from Nazi laws, then sure, you can say that Bulgaria was ruled by fascists. Wait. Before you start posting angry comments, hear me out on a couple of things. When I said ruled by fascists, I meant the politicians who push for stuff like the already mentioned anti-Jewish laws. It's downright impossible for me to defend those politicians and the Bulgarian Tsar. However, not every politician approved that policy. On the contrary, many Bulgarian politicians and journalists strongly opposed such policy, and it was especially not supported by the ordinary Bulgarian people, which leads to the other point I have. There is no excuse to attack the entire Bulgarian nation and call them all fascists. Yes, there are many people in Macedonia, and I'm not talking about internet trolls, but the intellectual class who say that the Bulgarians are a fascist nation.
To što postojano vi kada Bulgarija to napravila, fašistka i ne znam što, to je sramota. Bez razlike
Bulgarija je fašistička, nacifašistička država.
Ne, fašistička. Vi ste fašisti.
Nacifašistička država.
Nemojte taka.
I'm just gonna say it right now with no filters. The last people on our planet that should verbally attack Bulgaria because of their fascist past are Macedonians. Let me show you what I mean by that. The propaganda of Titovci was that the good Macedonian partisans were fighting against assimilation and terror from the evil Bulgarian fascists. But if that battle was national first and then ideological, then how come there was zero resistance before June 22nd? Why that day? Because on that day, Nazi Germany started its invasion of the Soviet Union, breaking the alliance it established with the USSR a couple of years ago. Because of that, communists and fascists became enemies again. Since Bulgaria was allied with the Axis, it also started treating communists as enemies of the state, although to be honest, the communists were considered enemies much earlier than the pact with the Axis powers. It's worth noting that, despite the alliance, Bulgaria did not send any of its troops to fight the Soviets. The communists, both in Bulgaria proper and the newly administrated territories, were arrested and thrown in prisons under the accusation of being a threat to the country. That was the start of the fighting in Macedonia. Firstly, on September 8th, the partisans were met by a man guarding a tunnel they were examining, and when the guard asked them to show their ID, one of the partisans, Lazo Kolevsky, pulled out a revolver and shot the guard in order to avoid arrest. Exactly 1 month later, a Macedonian partisan named Trajko Boškovski Tarcan was surrounded by the police in a house, but he managed to successfully escape, killing one policeman in the process. Then, on October 11, 1941, in the town of Prilep, 16 communists have organized a plan to attack a police station and free their communist comrades that were imprisoned there. They divided themselves into 3 groups with different tasks. The first group had the goal to get to the prison and free the communist prisoners. One partisan approached the prison guard, who didn't expect anything because they already knew each other, only for the partisan to shoot him and then try to release the prisoners. The task, however, failed as other policemen heard the gunfire and rushed to the scene, forcing the partisans to escape. The second group threw a bomb at the guardhouse, but no one was killed. The third group had the task to cut telephone wires and with that cut contact between the police station and the military garrison. That task was completed. Have you noticed how small these battles were? How there was barely any fighting? You would think that a nation under terror and assimilation would have a much larger resistance. Some propagandists try to sell stories how Macedonians massively joined the partisan movement, but a simple examination of the situation in Macedonia in 1941 and 1942 show that's a lie. As you can guess already, all the communists who were involved in these battles or were killed by the military or police forces were named Macedonian national heroes that fought for Macedonia's national liberation from the Bulgarian fascist occupier. Once again, Titovci falsified history by presenting a clear ideological battle as a national Macedonians versus Bulgarians battle. While I am saddened that young lives were lost during that period, communist or non-communist, I want to show you what happened in Bulgaria proper during World War II. These pictures you're watching at the moment are pictures of Bulgarian children killed by fascists. Some of these children were members of communist forces and killed in battles, but some of them were murdered solely because their older family members were communists. The cold-blooded murder of Nikol Chozdravkov Champoev definitely stands out. This boy, who was only 1 year old, was shot 12 times. A case like that, thankfully, didn't happen in Macedonia. Definitely evil, but the main point I'm trying to make is that these were Bulgarians killed by other Bulgarians, and those killings were based on a conflict between 2 ideologies. If you look at the murders in Macedonia during World War II, the situation is not at all different from the one in old Bulgaria. For example, the 17-year-old partisan named Nevena Georgieva Dunya that was supposedly killed by Bulgarian fascist occupiers was actually killed by Macedonians. Another example would be the Vatasha massacre, the worst crime against humanity in Macedonia during World War II. It was a massacre of 12 young Macedonian men, and that massacre was apparently carried out by Bulgarian fascist occupiers. Some Macedonian politicians today want Bulgaria to humiliate itself by sending its politicians to bow to the monument built in honor of these killed Macedonians and beg for forgiveness.
Ако е стварно денешната бугарска држава искрена, тогаш треба да почнеме со поклонување на бугарските државници пред, да речеме, споменикот на Ваташа.
It seems like they don't have basic historical knowledge to know that the man who ordered the massacre was Macedonian himself, and that the majority of the armed force who carried out the massacre were local Macedonians. So basically, the Bulgarians are asked to beg for forgiveness for a crime that wasn't done by Bulgarians to begin with. There are many more examples that show how killing of Macedonian communists done by Macedonian fascists were blamed on Bulgarians. This is sort of like the Austrian victim theory situation, where Austrians after World War II decided to remove all responsibility from themselves and put the entire blame on the Germans. With the Macedonians versus Bulgarians lie that acts as the core of Macedonian Titoist propaganda, everything bad was done by Bulgarian fascists and everything good was done by Macedonian communists. You will almost never see from Titovci even a mention of Bulgarian communist forces in Macedonia that fought alongside Macedonian partisans, such as the Hristo Botov Battalion and the Georgi Dimitrov Brigade. As a result of that, most Macedonians believe that on 13th of November 1944, which is a national holiday today, Skopje was liberated by Macedonian partisans from Bulgarian fascists. Aside from the fact that fascist Bulgaria capitulated on September 9th, making the liberation of Skopje from Bulgarian fascists impossible on a technical level, Skopje was liberated by Macedonian and Bulgarian partisans from German and Albanian Nazi forces, although I must add that there were many Albanians in the Macedonian partisan movement. Not only is the credit taken away from Bulgarians, but, yet again, they are blamed for something that they didn't do. That's what the entire Yugoslav anti-Bulgarian propaganda was. Bulgarians are the bad guys, and we are the good guys. Even in the extremely rare cases someone acknowledges that there were Macedonian fascists, that someone makes the argument that those Macedonians were serving the Bulgarian army, automatically making them Bulgarians. If we're going to use that logic, then the partisan movement in Macedonia was also Bulgarian. Remember how the Macedonian Regional Committee, led by Metodi Shaturov Sharlo, joined the Bulgarian Communist Party almost immediately after the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was conquered by the Axis powers? All those Macedonian national heroes were Bulgarian communists, so don't celebrate October 11th because it's a Bulgarian holiday. After all, it was organized by a man named after the first Tatar ruler of Danube, Bulgaria, and the guard killed that day was a blood relative of Dame Gruev, one of the greatest Macedonians of all time. Another thing, Macedonian communists, having no choice but to work with the Yugoslav Communist Party since 1943, doesn't add a national element in the battles. When Svetozar Vukmanović Tempo came to Macedonia in February of 1943, he wrote a report for the Yugoslav Communist Party. In that report, he mentioned that through the entire year of 1942, there were only 6 detachments with 10 to 15 fighters each. All of them, except one, were destroyed in battle, and how the Macedonian partisans didn't want to fight against Bulgarian occupation, but only against the reactionary government of Bogdan Filov. Later in his memoirs, Tempo wrote his speech he gave to Macedonians who didn't want to fight on the Sirmian front. His words were, "You spent the entire war in Bulgaria. You haven't fired a single rifle against the occupier. I am a bigger Macedonian than you. I fought for Macedonia's freedom while you lived easily in Bulgaria." So, there was barely any fighting, all the battles were based on ideological differences, and you had both Macedonians and Bulgarians in communist and fascist forces. What kind of national struggle are we talking about? The entire narrative was based around lies about evil Bulgarians and how all the evil was caused by them, such as the final thing we'll talk about in connection to World War II, the deportation of Jews. The Third Reich's Nazi government requested from Bulgaria to deport its entire Jewish population, including from the newly administrated territories. Around 11,000 Jews from the administrated areas were deported to the Treblinka extermination camp, and almost no one survived. This is definitely a horrifying event, but look at this. Aside from the already mentioned Bulgarian politicians who were against those anti-Jewish actions, the ordinary Bulgarian people stood up against their government to defend their fellow citizens. Their reaction was so powerful that they managed to save around 50,000 Jews from a certain death. This is something unheard of in the world.
ראיתי כומר צעיר יפה עם זקן שחור. הוא ביקש מהשוטרים ששמרו שם להיכנס, ואמרו לו אסור להיכנס. והוא אמר, אתם אומרים לי אסור להיכנס? ראיתי במו עיניי שהוא הפנה להם גב, טיפס על הגדר ונכנס לחצר. ואז כל הנוכחים בחצר הסתובבו, הם ידעו מי זה, זה עוטץ קיריל, היה המטרופוליט של פלובדיב, ואמרו לו, עוטץ קיריל, מה יהיה איתנו? והוא קרא להם ילדיי. ילדיי, אל תדאגו, אתם תישארו פה, ואם ישלחו אתכם, אני אלך איתכם.
כשנודעה תוכנית הגירוש של יהודי בולגריה, התארגנה קבוצה של חברי פרלמנט, ובראשם דימיטר פשב, ושל אנשי ציבור, ראשי הכנסייה ואזרחים מן השורה, כדי להפעיל לחץ על הממשלה ועל המלך לבטל את הגירוש.
זה דברים שאילו כולם היו כמותם, אולי לא היו נשמדים 6 מיליונים.
But no, Bulgarians are a fascist nation, totally. Unfortunately, such protests did not happen in Macedonia, and its entire Jewish population was deported. That begs the question, if the fact that ordinary Bulgarians taking action have given positive results, is it fair to put the entire blame on Bulgaria? I guess it's much easier to avoid any responsibility and simply state how everything is Bulgaria's fault. When you add all of these lies together, it becomes clear as day that there was a strong Yugoslav anti-Bulgarian propaganda in Socialist Macedonia that painted Bulgarians as monsters. The new generations were taught by the media and education to despise the Bulgarian people and to view them as their greatest enemy. However, while we can, rightfully so, criticize Tito and Titovci for planting the seeds for bulgarophobia seen even today, Tito and Socialist Yugoslavia died a long time ago. All other post-communist countries have done revisions of their history, and none of them are anywhere near critical of Bulgaria, not even other ex-Yugoslav states.
Za razliku od Južne Srbije gde su Bugari činili zločine, u Makedoniji su zaista se ponašali kao u svojoj zemlji. I budući veliki makedonski komunisti kao Kiro Gligorov su najnormalnije studirali u Sofiji. Znači, za razliku od drugih krajeva naše zemlje, Makedonci jedva da su osjetili rat. Ako uporedimo ulogu Bugarske sa Makedoncima ili kosovskim Albancima, Bugari su stvarno veći antifašisti. Više Bugara se borilo na strani naše narodno-oslobodilačke vojske nego kosovskih Albanaca i Makedonaca zajedno.
There's honestly nothing much I can say about the results of anti-Bulgarian propaganda that isn't already obvious. It's 2024 and the Macedono-Bulgarian relations have still not recovered. All the lies invented 60 years ago are still taught, and two closest nations are still the biggest enemies. With that being said, not everything is pessimistic. There are many politicians, journalists, historians, and even everyday people that are telling the truth and trying to rebuild brotherly relations. It's a noble cause, but also brave considering how stigmatized these people are. They are sick of all the lies, indoctrination, and hatred that they see today or even felt on their own skin. When I saw their motives, I asked myself, what have I done to help? I was also sick of lies and hate, but I figured out quickly there's no point in complaining. I had to take action. My protest is this documentary. If just one person out there watches this and realizes the truth, then I can say I succeeded in making things better. Perhaps my work will be a part of the collective effort to show the truth and rebuild bridges. I hope one day all these bad things we talked about turn into just bad memories. I hope one day the brotherly relationship between Bulgarians and Macedonians will come back, and I hope we all live long enough to see the return of that brotherhood one day. Until then, let's continue fighting for the truth, for Bulgaria, and for Macedonia.
Наистина, победата наближаваше.
Защищавам себе си като обвиняем комунист. Защищавам своята собствена комунистическа чест. Печатът не само ме хулише, но във връзка с мен наричаше и моя български народ див и варварски. Верно е, че българският фашизъм е див и варварски, но българската работническа класа и селените, българската народна интелигенция съвсем не са диваци и варвари. Диваци и варвари в България са само фашистите. Но аз питам господин председателя, в коя страна фашистите не са варвари и диваци? Ето защо протестирам против нападките срещу българския народ. Нямам причини да се срамувам, че съм българин и се гордея, че съм син на българската работническа класа.